I got to bring my panel in on this one. A.B. Stoddard, associate editor and columnist at Real Clear Politics. Michael Pesca, host of the Gist podcast from Slate, and Republican pollster and CEO of WPA Intelligence. Chris Wilson. Chris, I go to you first. These 12 Republicans, their no vote. Some on this list, like Maine Senator Susan Collins, Rand Paul, they were expected. But others like Rob Portman, Lamar Alexander, what do you take from their move?
Well, it's not as simple as whether or not it was constitutional. It's a tricky and nuanced question, and I've got clients on both sides of it. I had Senator Cruz, of course, who voted to support the president's position on this, and I had Senator Lee, who voted against it. And what it really comes down to is your definition of Article 1 and whether or not the National Emergencies Act, which was passed in 1976, and every president since 1976 has used it to declare a national emergency, applies in a situation. And Senator Cruz said, because of his belief on the border and the fact that there, just in February alone, there were 76,000 detainees. There were 1,700 kids who came, or families who came across the border with a child that could have been, that was not their own, but claimed it was their own. He said this is an emergency. And so because of that, that's really what it gets down to. And why Senator Cruz agreed to vote yes on this is because he got a commitment from the president to reform the National Emergencies Act, which provides 100 different situations specifically that allow you to declare an emergency. And that's just too much. And that's what he said. We need to reform this.
But you have other clients who did the opposite. I
did. Well, in the case of Senator Lee, he believes that the National Emergencies Act in and of itself is not constitutional. So you've kind of got, like I said, it is a nuanced position, and you really get down to cases going back to 1981 versus Reagan, in which they determined whether or not it is a foreign policy emergency or not. And so again, Senator Cruz believes it is a foreign emergency, whereas Senator Lee may disagree with that. And that's why I said there are constitutional concerns on both sides. It's not enough just to say, oh well, it is a constitutional issue. It is deeper than that, and it's nuanced.
How about it being a re-election issue, A.B.? When I look at who's standing with the president, it overwhelmingly seems to be people who are up for re-election.
It's very surprising, actually, that so many of them went with the president, fearing, of course, the primary challenge more than the damage this vote does to their general election prospects in Colorado, North Carolina, Arizona, Iowa, Texas, and Georgia, places where Democrats will be very motivated, very energized, and that Republicans now believe are in play and threatens their Senate majority. So interesting to see Susan Collins, the only Republican in cycle who placed the general election in her campaign next year over the threat of a primary challenge, unlike the others.
Michael, what's your take? I'm looking at the Denver Post rebuking their endorsement of Cory Gardner, now calling it a mistake.
Yeah, and that could imperil him. I don't know that there was a need to reform the National Emergencies Act before Donald Trump thrusted it upon us. I mean, in the past, there was a hurricane and the president declared an emergency and the government helped. And I just have to think, I mean, Chris, if Mike Lee and Ted Cruz got in a room, ideological soulmates, and they each debated the merits of this issue, I cannot imagine Ted Cruz, champion debater, either winning that debate or full-throatedly even backing it. It seems such a poor argument to say that this is an advancement of the Constitution and a protection of the branch in which they serve. And the other thing I would say is it seems as a long-term strategy, it is just terrible for the Republicans because there's not always going to be a Republican
But Michael,
president.
nobody has a long-term strategy in business, politics, or life today. Come on.
Well, perhaps they should.
Listen, I'm with you, perhaps they should, but welcome to short-termism 2019.
Okay, so then if there's President Bernie Sanders in 2020, and he wants to fund Medicare for all as he defines it with $30 trillion, and Congress says no, and then he says, yeah, it's an emergency, what's Congress to do? Thank you, Senator Cruz, for that.
Well, I don't know that I agree that it's been used for improper purposes. I mean, you could make a claim, and this is what many people did, is that when President Obama used it, that those were not true emergencies. And really what it does, it gets down to your definition as to what is emergency and is not. And I would say reasonable people can agree or disagree on that. So to say this is just a constitutional debate is not proper. It is what the vote was on yesterday is whether or not you believe the crisis at the border is an emergency. And Ted Cruz and John Cornyn, used two Texas senators, both said they believed it was.
I just think you have to protect that branch of Congress called the legislative, which is an Article 1 branch, and they're not doing it. They're not doing their job.
It is in reform Article 1.
Okay, A.B.
Article 1 bill.
Democrats are still short the 67 votes they need to override this veto by President Trump. What are they to do here?
Well, Senator Schumer, the Democratic leader in the Senate yesterday, said that they're going to bring up more votes. There's talk about maybe doing this every 6 months. I don't know what their next move is. They're not going to have a vote to override the veto since there won't be enough votes to override the veto. This is why Republicans privately were calling this the jailbreak vote, because this was the vote for Republicans who call themselves constitutional conservatives to come out and express themselves on. I'm actually surprised that there weren't more of them. Someone like Senator Pat Roberts, who's retiring from Kansas. I mean, he doesn't have to fear the wrath of the right wing of his party and his state. So this was the vote. They're not going to have another one. Democrats, they can make plans for future votes. I'm sure that they will.
I'm sure they will. All right, stick around. We have a lot more to cover, but we're going to take a quick break. Up next.